On the evening of September 2, 1998, Swissair Flight 111 departed John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York bound for Geneva, carrying 229 people aboard, 215 passengers and 14 crew members. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, a wide-body trijet that represented the technological confidence of modern aviation in the 1990s. Swissair itself was regarded as one of the world's most prestigious airlines, known for precision, discipline, and safety. Nothing about the departure suggested that within a little over an hour, the flight would become one of the most haunting and instructive disasters in aviation history, a tragedy defined not by explosion or terrorism, but by an invisible enemy spreading silently above the passengers' heads. The flight lifted off at 8:18 p.m. local time, climbing smoothly into the night sky over the eastern United States. Inside the cabin, passengers settled into the long overnight transatlantic journey. Many were business travelers, academics, diplomats, and families returning home. The cockpit was staffed by an experienced crew. Captain Hugh McQuarrie was a veteran pilot with over 10,800 flight hours. First Officer Alfred Maurer had more than 9,000 hours of experience. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, beginning meal service, while the aircraft cruised normally at 33,000 feet. For the first 50 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as expected. At approximately 9:10 p.m., subtle signs of trouble began to appear. A faint odor, described later as unusual but not immediately alarming, was detected in the cockpit. The smell was similar to that of overheated electronics or insulation. In modern aircraft, such odors are taken seriously, but they are not always immediately associated with an active fire. Electrical smells can come from air conditioning packs, galley equipment, or minor component failures. The crew discussed the smell calmly, attempting to identify its source while continuing to monitor the aircraft systems. Within minutes, the odor intensified. Smoke began to appear, thin at first, drifting near the cockpit ceiling. At 9:14 p.m., the pilots made the critical decision to contact air traffic control. They reported smoke in the cockpit and requested a diversion. Halifax Stanfield International Airport in Nova Scotia was selected due to its proximity and long runways capable of handling a wide-body jet. The aircraft began a descent and turned toward the Canadian coast. At this stage, no emergency had yet been declared, and the tone of the communication remained controlled. The crew still believed they had time. Unbeknownst to them, a fire was already burning in the most dangerous place imaginable, the attic space above the cockpit ceiling. This area, hidden from direct view, was filled with bundles of wiring insulated with metallized polyethylene terephthalate, known as mylar. This material had been widely used in aircraft for its lightweight and insulation properties, but it was later discovered to be highly flammable and capable of spreading fire rapidly once ignited. The exact ignition source has never been definitively identified, but investigators later concluded that faulty wiring associated with the in-flight entertainment system most likely caused arcing, which ignited the insulation. As the fire spread above the cockpit, it grew rapidly, feeding on insulation and wiring. Smoke thickened and began to pour downward. The crew donned oxygen masks, a procedure that immediately changed the dynamics of cockpit communication. Once masked, pilots must communicate through microphones with limited clarity. At 9:16 p.m., Swissair 111 officially declared an emergency. Air traffic controllers cleared the aircraft to descend and prepared Halifax for an emergency landing. Fire crews were placed on standby. From the ground, the situation still appeared manageable. Inside the aircraft, however, conditions were deteriorating at a frightening pace. Smoke became dense and acrid, reducing visibility and making breathing difficult. The fire, still unseen, was now attacking critical systems. Electrical failures began cascading through the aircraft. Displays flickered and went dark. Autopilot functions failed. Warning systems malfunctioned. The MD-11's design relied heavily on electrical power, and as wiring burned, the aircraft was slowly being blinded and deafened. The pilots attempted to follow standard smoke and fire checklists, which were extensive and time-consuming. These procedures were designed under the assumption that crews would have sufficient time to diagnose and isolate the problem. In the case of Swissair 111, time was the one thing they did not have. The fire was spreading far faster than anyone had anticipated, driven by materials later recognized as catastrophically unsafe. At 9:20 p.m., the aircraft leveled temporarily at 10,000 feet as instructed by air traffic control, a standard step to dump fuel before landing. This decision, made according to procedure, would later be questioned, but at the time it seemed reasonable. The aircraft was heavy with fuel for the transatlantic crossing, and landing overweight posed its own risks. What the crew did not know was that every second spent in the air allowed the fire to grow stronger and more destructive. Smoke began to fill the cabin. Passengers, unaware of the true severity of the situation, likely sensed that something was wrong. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, attempting to remain calm and reassure those on board. There was no panic reported, no screaming, no chaos. This silence, preserved forever by the lack of a cockpit voice recorder beyond the final minutes, has become one of the most haunting aspects of the tragedy. By 9:24 p.m. the cockpit was in crisis. Multiple flight instruments failed almost simultaneously. Communications with air traffic control became intermittent and garbled. The crew struggled to maintain situational awareness as the fire severed system after system. The aircraft began descending more rapidly than intended. The pilots were now flying partially blind, relying on limited backup instruments. At 9:25 p.m. the cockpit voice recorder captured the final coherent words from the crew. Smoke alarms sounded continuously. Shortly afterward, the recording ended, likely due to loss of power. Radar data showed Swissair 111 entering a steep descent. The aircraft was no longer under controlled flight. At approximately 9:31 p.m., the MD-11 struck the Atlantic Ocean near Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia, at high speed. The impact destroyed the aircraft instantly. There were no survivors. The crash site was spread across the ocean floor, with debris scattered over several kilometers. Recovery efforts began immediately, involving the Canadian Coast Guard, Navy, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and countless volunteers. The operation became one of the largest and most complex aviation recovery efforts in history. Over months and years, nearly every piece of the aircraft was recovered from depths of up to 55 meters. The wreckage was painstakingly reassembled in a hangar, allowing investigators to reconstruct the sequence of events in extraordinary detail. The investigation revealed a sobering truth. The fire had been uncontrollable almost from the moment it ignited. The materials used in the aircraft's wiring insulation acted like fuel. Once lit, the fire spread invisibly above the ceiling, beyond the reach of onboard fire extinguishers. By the time smoke became visible in the cockpit, the aircraft was already doomed unless it could land within minutes. The role of the in-flight entertainment system became a central focus. This system had been installed as a supplemental modification, not part of the original aircraft design. Its wiring was routed through areas not adequately protected against fire. Certification standards at the time did not require a full assessment of how such systems could interact with existing wiring in the event of a failure. Swissair 111 exposed a critical weakness in the regulatory framework governing aircraft modifications. Equally significant were the cockpit procedures. Investigators concluded that existing checklists underestimated the urgency of smoke events. The philosophy at the time emphasized troubleshooting and system management rather than immediate landing. Swissair 111 demonstrated that in the presence of uncontrolled smoke, the only viable response is to get the aircraft on the ground as quickly as possible, regardless of fuel state or other considerations. The human cost of the disaster resonated deeply across multiple nations. Many of the passengers were prominent figures in science, finance, and international organizations. Families were left without answers for months as identification efforts progressed slowly due to the severity of the crash. Memorials were established in Canada, Switzerland, and the United States. The quiet fishing village of Peggy's Cove became forever linked with one of aviation's darkest nights. Out of the tragedy emerged sweeping changes. Flammable insulation materials like mylar were banned from aircraft. New standards were introduced requiring rigorous fire testing of all wiring insulation. Smoke detection and suppression systems were improved. Certification rules for in-flight entertainment and other supplemental systems were overhauled. Most importantly, pilot training philosophies changed. Smoke in the cockpit is now treated as an immediate life-threatening emergency requiring the fastest possible landing. Swissair Flight 111 stands as a stark reminder that modern aviation disasters do not always come with dramatic explosions or violent external forces. Sometimes they begin with a smell, a wisp of smoke, and a fire hidden just out of sight. It is a story of technology outpaced by risk, of procedures written for slower threats, and of a crew fighting with extraordinary professionalism against an enemy they could not see and could not stop. More than 2 decades later, the legacy of Swissair 111 continues to shape aviation safety worldwide. Every improved wire, every revised checklist, and every redesigned certification standard carries the silent imprint of that night over the Atlantic. The passengers and crew did not survive, but the lessons learned from their final flight have saved countless lives since, ensuring that their loss was not in vain.